Some moments crystallize betrayal so perfectly that they become permanently seared into collective memory. The Ashwood Harvest Festival that October became exactly that kind of moment. The night an entire community watched a good man's world collapse in real time. The annual festival was Ashwood's proudest tradition. Pumpkin displays crafted by local farmers. Apple cider served in mason jars by the Methodist church ladies. A pie contest that generated more drama than most reality TV shows. Everyone attended, from newborns and strollers to elderly residents in wheelchairs, because missing the Harvest Festival meant missing the social event of the year. Luther had been looking forward to it for weeks. He cleaned his best jeans, trimmed his beard, and even bought a new flannel shirt specifically for the occasion. In his mind, this would be the perfect opportunity to show off Narissa's transformation to the entire community, to publicly celebrate what they'd accomplished together. He should have realized something was wrong when Narissa showed no enthusiasm for attending together. She made vague comments about needing to make an appearance for work reasons, about Marcus expecting his staff to represent the company well. Luther hadn't questioned it because he trusted his wife completely, a trust that was about to be shattered in the most public way possible. The festival was in full swing when Luther arrived alone, telling concerned neighbors that Narissa would join him later. He wandered between booths, sampling kettle corn and admiring the carved pumpkins, checking his phone periodically for messages that never came. The moment of truth arrived near the apple bobbing station, where a crowd had gathered to watch teenagers compete for prizes. Luther was heading toward the sound of laughter when he saw them, Narissa and Marcus, walking hand in hand between the craft booths like they owned the entire festival. But it wasn't just their joined hands that stopped Luther in his tracks. It was everything else. The way Narissa leaned into Marcus when he whispered something in her ear. The way she laughed at his comments with genuine delight. The way she wore a dress Luther had never seen before, expensive, form-fitting, chosen specifically to impress someone who wasn't her husband. And then there was the bracelet, a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the festival lights and threw sparkles across Narissa's wrist like tiny fireworks. Luther knew their household budget down to the penny. He knew every piece of jewelry his wife owned. This bracelet cost more than Luther made in 3 months, and it definitely hadn't come from their joint account. The crowd noticed them too. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as neighbors pointed and whispered. Phones appeared, snapping photos that would circulate through social media within minutes. In a matter of moments, Luther's private humiliation became Ashwood's public entertainment. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Harold Brewster, a farmer whose opinion carried weight in local circles. "Looks like someone's been keeping secrets." "That's Marcus Delacroix from the logistics company," whispered Martha Hendricks, the town's unofficial gossip coordinator. "Heard he's been divorced 3 times already." "Poor Luther," added Betty Morrison, shaking her head with practiced sympathy. "Man helps his wife lose all that weight just to watch her parade around with her boss." Luther stood frozen in the middle of the festival grounds, surrounded by people who were simultaneously staring at him and trying to pretend they hadn't noticed the spectacle. He could feel their pity washing over him in waves, the kind of suffocating sympathy that makes humiliation even worse. Narissa finally spotted him across the crowd. Their eyes locked for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Luther saw recognition, then surprise, then something that looked almost like defiance. She didn't release Marcus's hand. She didn't walk over to explain. She simply stared at her husband with the cold expression of someone who had already moved on to a different life. That's when Luther understood that his marriage wasn't just over. It had been over for months, and he'd been the only one too blind to see it. Betrayal doesn't just break hearts, it rewires brains. What happened to Luther Quinn in the weeks following a harvest festival wasn't just depression or anger. It was a complete psychological reconstruction that transformed a gentle man into something his own mother wouldn't have recognized. The first sign came when Luther stopped showing up to work regularly. For 15 years, he'd opened Quinn's auto repair at exactly 7 a.m., 6 days a week without fail. Suddenly, neighbors would drive past at noon to find the garage door still locked, Luther's truck still in the driveway. When customers complained, Luther would mumble apologies and promise to get to their repairs soon, but soon never came. Cars sat in his lot for weeks while he disappeared into his house, emerging only to buy groceries or pick up alcohol from the package store. The drinking started slowly, a beer with dinner, then two, then half a 12-pack before bed. But as the humiliation settled deeper into his bones, the alcohol became less about numbing the pain and more about fueling something darker. Rage, yes, but also a cold calculation that worried a few friends who still tried to reach out to him. Luther ain't himself anymore, confided Buster Hawkins to his wife after a failed attempt to check on his old fishing buddy. Got this look in his eyes like he's working out a math problem nobody else can see. The most disturbing change was Luther's new hobby, research. His kitchen table disappeared under stacks of newspapers, crime magazines, and printouts from true crime websites. He'd sit there for hours, reading about revenge plots and studying case files like a detective preparing for trial. Neighbors walking past his house reported seeing the flicker of his computer screen through the windows at all hours. Luther was consuming every story he could find about wronged husbands who'd taken justice into their own hands. The successful ones. The ones who'd gotten away with it. The ones who'd made the betrayers pay in ways that couldn't be undone. He started taking drives around town at odd hours, learning schedules and routines he'd never paid attention to before. When did Marcus leave for work? Which restaurants did he frequent? Where did he and Nerissa go for their public displays of affection? Luther cataloged these details in a composition notebook he kept hidden in his toolbox. Saw Luther parked outside the logistics building again yesterday, reported Agnes Kowalski to cluster women who gather at the post office each morning. Just sitting there watching. That man's planning something, mark my words. The notebook became Luther's Bible. Page after page of meticulous observations written in the same careful handwriting he'd once used to document car repairs. Marcus's routine was mapped out minute by minute. Nerissa's new habits were analyzed and predicted. Even seemingly random details like which parking spaces they preferred and which routes they took through town were recorded with scientific precision. Luther's friends stopped trying to help him after a few disturbing conversations revealed how far he'd drifted from a man they'd known. When Buster suggested maybe it was time to file divorce papers and move on, Luther had stared at her with eyes that seemed to look right through him. Moving on assumes there's somewhere to go, Luther had said, his voice carrying a flatness that made Buster's skin crawl. Some bridges, once they're burned, they take everything else down with them. The transformation accelerated when Luther discovered something that changed everything. Marcus wasn't just sleeping with his wife. He was stealing from his own company. Buried in the research Luther had been conducting were financial records that revealed systematic embezzlement dating back 3 years. This discovery shifted Luther's focus from emotional revenge to something far more methodical. He began photocopying documents, building files, and constructing a case that would destroy Marcus professionally and personally. But as Luther dug deeper into the evidence, a darker question began forming in his mind. Why settle for ruining Marcus's career when he could ruin his entire existence? Why expose the embezzlement to authorities when there were other, more permanent ways to ensure Marcus would never hurt another family again? The composition notebook's entries became less about observation and more about planning. Luther was no longer just watching his wife's lover. He was designing his destruction. And somewhere in the darkness of his garage, surrounded by the tools of his trade, Luther Quinn was becoming someone capable of things that would horrify even the people who understood his pain. The question wasn't whether Luther would act on his plans. The question was how far he'd be willing to go. Every man has a breaking point. That precise moment when humiliation transforms from wound into weapon. For Luther Quinn, that moment arrived on a crisp October evening at Flanagan Pub, where Marcus Delacroix made a mistake that sealed both their fates. The pub buzzed with its usual crowd of after-work drinkers and weekend regulars. Luther hadn't planned to be there, but his empty house had felt suffocating, and he'd hoped a change of scenery might quiet the thoughts racing through his head. He'd chosen a corner booth, nursing a whiskey and observing the crowd with the detached interest of someone who no longer felt connected to normal human interaction. Marcus arrived with his usual entourage, younger men from the logistics company who laughed too loudly at his jokes and competed for his approval like eager puppies. They commandeered the bar's center section, ordering expensive drinks and making sure everyone knew they had money to spend. Luther could have left, should have left, but something kept him rooted to his seat, watching his wife's lover hold court like some small-town king who'd forgotten he was still just another middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a history of failed marriages. The alcohol made Marcus careless with his words and cavalier with his audience. As the evening progressed, his stories became more personal, his observations more cruel. He began describing his conquest of Nerissa with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions. "You should have seen her husband," Marcus announced to his assembled audience, his voice carrying clearly across the pub's cramped interior. "Poor bastard spent 2 years turning her into something worth wanting, then acted surprised when she realized she could do better." Laughter rippled through his group, the kind of mean-spirited chuckling that accompanies stories told at someone else's expense. "I mean, seriously," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. "Imagine spending your whole life fixing junk, then getting upset when your wife figures out she doesn't have to settle for junk anymore." The words hit Luther like physical blows. Bad enough that Marcus had stolen his wife. Now he was entertaining a room full of strangers with the story of Luther's humiliation. This wasn't just adultery anymore. This was public mockery designed to destroy whatever dignity Luther had left. That night, Luther drove home in silence, his hand steady on the steering wheel despite the rage burning through his veins. Back in his garage, he opened a composition notebook and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the last page. "Some problems require permanent solutions." Marcus Delacroix had made his final mistake. Now, Luther would make his final decision. What happened next depends on who's telling the story, and in Ashwood, Missouri, everyone has their own version of the truth. But whether you believe in the calculated revenge or the blood-soaked garage, one thing remains certain. Luther Quinn's solution was as methodical as everything else he'd ever done in his life. Some say Luther chose the path of legal vengeance, using Marcus's own greed as a weapon that would destroy him. This version begins with Luther spending weeks photoencopying financial documents that Marcus had been careless enough to leave in office trash bins. Bank records, client invoices, expense reports that didn't add up, evidence of a 3-year embezzlement scheme that had stolen nearly $200,000 from Ashwood Logistics. Luther's mechanical mind approached the evidence like he'd approach a complex engine repair, systematically, thoroughly, with attention to every detail that could make or break the final result. He cross-referenced dates, tracked money transfers, and built a case that would have impressed federal investigators. The anonymous packages began arriving at strategic locations throughout Ashwood and beyond. The FBI field office in Springfield received copies of financial records with a typed note explaining the embezzlement scheme. The Internal Revenue Service got documentation of unreported income. Local newspapers received summaries of the scandal with enough proof to justify full investigations. But Luther's masterstroke was personal. He mailed copies of Marcus's financial crimes directly to Nerissa's home address, ensuring she discovered that her new lover was not only a serial adulterer, but also a federal criminal who'd built his wealth on stolen money. Within 6 weeks, Marcus's world collapsed completely. Federal agents raided his office. His assets were frozen pending investigation. His 3 ex-wives filed civil suits claiming he'd hidden marital assets during their divorce proceedings. And Nerissa? She found herself associated with a man facing 20 years in federal prison and social disgrace that would follow her for the rest of her life. Luther never claimed credit for the anonymous tips, but everyone in Ashwood knew who'd orchestrated Marcus's downfall. The mechanic had taken apart his enemy's life with the same precision he'd once used to rebuild engines. But others whisper a different story, one that explains why certain people in Ashwood still lock their doors at night and avoid mentioning the Quinn name in polite conversation. This version begins with Luther inviting Marcus and Nerissa to his garage under the pretense of discussing closure and dividing up marital assets. The invitation came via email from an account Luther had created specifically for this purpose, using language that suggested legal mediation rather than personal confrontation. Marcus, confident in his physical superiority and convinced that Luther was too broken to pose any real threat, agreed to the meeting. Nerissa, guilty enough to want some kind of resolution, decided to accompany him for what she assumed would be an uncomfortable but necessary conversation about ending their marriage civilly. They arrived at Luther's garage on a cold November evening to find the space transformed. The usual automotive equipment had been moved aside. Plastic sheeting covered the concrete floor. Work lights had been repositioned to eliminate shadows. This wasn't a garage anymore. It was something else entirely. Luther waited for them with the patient stillness of someone who'd planned every detail of what was about to happen. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Just a man who'd been pushed beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior and had decided that some problems required permanent solutions. What followed was whispered about, but never officially confirmed. Stories about screaming that stopped too quickly, about a cleanup that took 3 days and required industrial solvents, about missing persons reports that led nowhere because everyone assumed Marcus and Narissa had simply run away together to avoid the mounting legal troubles. Luther's behavior in the weeks following their disappearance was described as eerily normal. He reopened his auto repair shop. He resumed his regular routines. He answered investigators' questions with the calm precision of someone who had nothing to hide. No one could prove anything because no one could find any evidence of what had actually happened in that garage. Here's what True Crime Speaks has learned from researching similar cases. Revenge rarely follows the neat narratives we see in movies. It's messy, complicated, and usually involves elements of both calculated planning and explosive emotion. Whether Luther destroyed Marcus through legal channels or more direct methods, the result was the same: complete annihilation of the people who'd humiliated him. The man who'd spent his life fixing things had finally encountered problems that couldn't be repaired, only eliminated. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't the question of which version is true. It's the realization that both versions represent the same fundamental truth. When someone methodical decides to seek revenge, they don't just hurt their targets. They destroy them so completely that recovery becomes impossible. Luther Quinn had spent 2 years learning how to build someone up. It took him less than 2 months to figure out how to tear them down. Small towns aren't supposed to have unsolved mysteries. They're supposed to be places where everyone knows everyone else's business, where secrets can't survive the constant scrutiny of neighbors who've known each other since childhood. But Luther Quinn's story turned Ashwood into something it had never been before, a community divided by doubt, suspicion, and the uncomfortable realization that they might have been living next to the killer. The official investigation lasted 6 months and concluded exactly nothing. Marcus Delacroix and Narissa Quinn had simply vanished, leaving behind financial crimes, abandoned belongings, and a trail of questions that led nowhere. Their cars were found at a truck stop 50 miles outside town, suggesting they'd fled together to avoid the mounting legal consequences of Marcus's embezzlement. Federal investigators interviewed Luther multiple times, searching for any evidence that he'd been involved in their disappearance. They found a man who answered questions calmly, maintained consistent stories, and showed appropriate concern for his missing wife. His garage was searched twice. His financial records were examined. His alibi for the night they vanished was verified by neighbors who'd seen him working late in his shop. But evidence and instinct told different stories, especially in a town where people had watched Luther's transformation from heartbroken husband to something much more dangerous. The community split into 2 distinct camps. Team Luther believed he was a victim twice over. First betrayed by his wife, then suspected by authorities who needed someone to blame for crimes they couldn't solve. These supporters saw him as a man who'd been pushed to his breaking point, but had ultimately chosen the legal path of exposing Marcus's financial crimes rather than seeking physical revenge. Luther Quinn's got more integrity in his little finger than Marcus Delacroix had in his whole body, insisted Betty Morrison during one of many heated discussions at the post office. If Marcus and that woman ran off together, it's because they couldn't face the shame of what they'd done. Team Suspicious harbored darker theories about Luther's involvement in the disappearances. They pointed to his months of research, his careful documentation of Marcus's routines, and his transformation from gentle mechanic to someone capable of methodical planning. These residents avoided eye contact with Luther at the grocery store and made sure their children didn't play too close to his property. You don't just learn that much about someone without planning to use it, whispered Harold Brewster to anyone who'd listen. And you don't set up a garage like he had it that night without expecting to clean up something messy. The division went deeper than gossip and speculation. Friendships ended over arguments about Luther's guilt or innocence. Church congregations split between those who believed in forgiveness and those who demanded justice. Even local businesses took sides, with some refusing to serve Luther, while others made a point of supporting him against what they saw as unfair persecution. Luther himself seemed oddly unaffected by the controversy swirling around him. He reopened his auto repair shop and continued serving customers who chose to trust him. He attended the same church, shopped at the same stores, and maintained the same routines he'd followed for years. If he was guilty of anything beyond being a cuckolded husband, he showed no signs of remorse or fear. The case officially remains unsolved, but in Ashwood, Missouri, it's never really ended. 5 years later, people still debate what happened in Luther Quinn's garage that November night. They still wonder whether justice was served or whether a killer walks free among them. And Luther? He still fixes cars, still lives in the same house, and still carries himself with the quiet dignity of a man who knows exactly what he's done and has made peace with all of it. The story of Luther and Nerissa Quinn isn't just another true crime case. It's a mirror that reflects the darkest possibilities lurking inside ordinary people. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, revenge, and the thin line separating civilization from savagery. Here's what makes this case so disturbing. Luther Quinn wasn't a monster. He was a decent man who loved his wife, worked hard, paid his bills, and treated people fairly. But betrayal and humiliation rewired his moral compass so completely that he became capable of things that would have horrified his former self.